Just don't move it once you have it somewhere. Just leave it alone. Hello everyone, my name is Adina from Plantsbutbetter, and today we're covering everything there is to know about this plant right here, Scindapsus Moonlight, or sterling silver Scindapsus. If you notice that this plant is covered in cinnamon, I will talk about it in just a bit. For the appearance, I would say this plant looks more expensive than it is, and it's pretty much a very uncommon plant, and it can be a bit of a diva, so I would not recommend this for beginners, just to say it from the start. However, if you do your research and watch this video, you can totally get it, because who am I to tell you what to buy or not? Oh yes, the care meter. I would say this plant is a 7 out of 10, just because it's a bit, yeah, you know, pretentious. But other than that, it looks like a 10 out of 10, that's for sure. Let's talk about light. This plant will not grow very well if it doesn't receive bright and direct light. A sign that your plant is not getting enough light is that the new leaves will not be as silvery as they should be. Also, another sign that your plant is not getting enough light is that the leaves will curl. But this is the tricky part, because the leaves will curl for a lot of different reasons. And for some people, this plant is a bit more difficult to grow. I had problems with this plant as well in the beginning, and it took me quite some time to figure out what does it need, what does it like, and so on. I would say this is not the best grower, so compared to the regular Exotica Scindapsus, this will grow way slower. So that's why the light is a very important factor for this plant. If you don't have enough light in your home, consider getting a grow light, because I tried that as well with this plant and it did wonders. I mean, there is no problem if your home is not bright enough. You still have hope. Moving on to watering. So Scindapsus Moonlight is a bit sensitive when it comes to water. Once every 2 weeks, I would say, is usually good. I would recommend to check the soil before you water this plant to see if the top 3 to 4 centimeters are completely dry, and if they are not, just wait a bit longer. A sign that your plant needs water is the fact that the leaves will get curly, but guess what? A sign that you overwatered your plant is, again, that the leaves will turn curly. That's why this plant is a bit tricky in the beginning. I will cover everything there is to know about the curly leaves, because this can be caused by lack of humidity, or by temperature stress, or by overwatering, or by underwatering, or by over-fertilizing, so there could be a shit ton of problems. Okay, so let's talk about temperature, because this plant is very sensitive to temperature stress, meaning that I will not move it once you place it somewhere, because this will cause the leaves to curl, as I've said earlier. The best temperature for this plant would be pretty average. I would say something between 20 to 26 degrees Celsius is great. Just don't move it once you have it somewhere. Just leave it alone. It doesn't like extreme cold, and it doesn't like extreme heat either. Moving on to humidity. And you guessed it already, because the Scindapsus Moonlight leaves will also curl if they lack humidity. Try to aim at least 50%. The higher the humidity, the better. If you can provide a humidifier, is great. So if your plant doesn't need water, is not overwatered as well, it has an average constant temperature, maybe the humidity is the problem. We will talk now about fertilizing, because the leaves will curl if you over-fertilize this plant. I would say once a month is pretty much the rule for every houseplant. In the winter time, I usually stop fertilizing my plants, because winter is usually associated with dormancy, and if your plants go dormant, they don't need feeding. Also, this plant is a very slow grower, and you don't know for sure if it's growing during winter, and that's why I would advise you to stop fertilizing altogether. For the NPK ratio, I use something very balanced, like a 10-10-10, and I would suggest to use a more diluted solution and a bit less often. Moving on to substrate. I use for this plant a very lightweight mix that is based on cocoa coir, some perlite, and some pine barks. You can also add some regular potting soil or some active charcoal, whatever you have, but please don't use just regular potting soil, because that is usually too heavy on the roots. Try to add at least perlite. I mean 50-50. Regular potting soil and 50% perlite. If the substrate is too heavy, it will cause root rot and the curly leaves again. I think root rot is the last sign you should look for. if you see those curly leaves. So yeah, the more lightweight the substrate, the better. Moving on to plastic versus terracotta. So I had this plant in both plastic and terracotta, and I would say it can survive in both, but with this plant I would choose plastic though. This plant doesn't need the substrate to be completely dry, and terracotta is great for other types of plants like maybe sansevierias, and with plastic you can be a bit less careful, if you know what I mean. Whatever you choose though, please make sure it has drainage holes, because root rot. Moving on to repotting, and the only sign you should look for before repotting is crowded roots. If you see the roots coming out of the drainage holes, then it's time to move out. It's important to choose a pot only slightly bigger than the previous one, and also to be very gentle when you deal with the roots. I would recommend to repot your plant during spring or summer, because this plant is very sensitive in general, and warmer periods of time are usually helping the plant to regenerate a bit faster. That's not 100% necessary, but that is something I would do for the sake of this plant. Moving on to propagation. You can propagate this plant by cuttings. You can use water or sphagnum moss or coco coir or perlite. I mean, the possibilities are almost endless. So I usually find water propagation a bit easier. However, with this plant, I like to propagate it in zip bags. I mean, place them into a clean container with some sphagnum moss or coco coir, spray them with some water, place them into a zip bag, and then almost forget about them. And I think I find propagating in soil a bit easier because this plant is a slow grower. I tried with water as well, but I wasn't that successful. So I would say propagating by leafless cuttings is great. I will also make a separate video about propagating Scindapsus in general, and if I did it already, you will see it in the description box. But other than that, that's all I had to say in this segment for now. Okay, moving on to pests. And fortunately, I didn't have any problems with this plant. With pests, because in the other segments I have a shit ton of problems. Like, you know, root rot and all that jazz. But pests didn't appear, so that's great. If there could be any problems, I would say maybe mealybugs or thrips could affect this plant, but we will have a separate video for that as well. And other than that, I will talk about toxicity next. And unfortunately, this plant is not pet friendly. And now you know every problem there is to know with this plant. As I said, I would not recommend this plant for beginners, but now you pretty much know everything there is to know. So maybe you can get it anyway. If you have any questions that I didn't cover in this video, you can leave them in the comments. And until next time, don't forget to take care of yourself and your plants.